Without further ado, brevity is a sort of wit, so I won't reintroduce the speakers because you've all read their biographies, but we're extremely thankful to all of them because they've been very busy to come here. So we'll go over some questions. We'll have kind of a round table or semicircular discussion for about half an hour among ourselves. And afterwards, we'll open it to Q&A, discussion, questions, comments, lectures. So my first question.
What happened to the T logo?
Well, the problem. Well, that's the. Yeah, don't rub it in. I mean, the T logo is a major problem because, we can't sue Trump for patent infringement, even though Temple University was there long before Trump was created, and it will last much longer than Trump. So we're revising, we're reviewing this, and we have a committee to study the logo. But thank you for asking this question. I recognize a loyal Trump supporter who's concerned. So my first kind of question discussion will be to Miya, who's an expert in American politics and American history, but also teaches here in Japan. Most of her students are Japanese. And if we think of the reaction to Trump, I think in Europe it's been relatively easy for Europeans to relate to this because there are in almost every European country politicians and political parties that are somewhat similar to Trump. Personalities may be different, but the ideology, the type of voters they appeal to, their message, whether you're talking about the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, the Netherlands, they're there, and also in Central Europe. But in Japan, there really is no equivalent to this type of politics. The issues of immigration, globalization, Judaism, they all play very differently. So I'd be interested to know how you think your students or Japanese have reacted to this and how it impacts their view of the United States.
It's already. Thank you, Robert. Thank you for having me on this panel. I am still in a shocking mood, so my mind is very confusing. So forgive me if I made a kind of confusing comment. But let me just say about the all of us, including myself and my colleagues and my students, have been watching this campaign very closely. Were yesterday very surprised and, to be honest, very shocked. And I realized myself that how little I know about the psychology of Americans who voted for Trump. We only have known Americans who are living in the cosmopolitan cities and well-educated, college-educated. And through my conversation with my colleagues and friends and my students, I have never come across any single person who supported or sympathized with Trump's rhetoric. And typical comments are something like, why Trump can be a symbol of change, or why can be a symbol of reform, why people can tolerate his racist and sexist comments for the sake of change, why the businessman can get away with being categorized as establishments. Isn't he part of the business establishment, probably protected by the establishments? And some people say it will be horrifying if the campaign talk of Trump set a new standard of behavior or moral code domestically and internationally. So we are very shocked and depressed by the result, mostly. And my student reaction, most of my students point three things. The first, the fact that the election, they're surprised to see the fact that the election took a long process is very something different from Japanese system. And some said American who first felt upset to the rhetoric of Trump might have somewhat got used to it or become insensitive to it, ironically, through this long process of election. And then students also said that most of my students didn't know the fact that the voters must register to cast a vote in the U.S. So because Japanese students take it for granted to have voter registration notice or voter, will be coming in next month or so. So these are the differences that my students felt so interesting and so impressed.
Thank you. I'd like to kind of turn to Ken. Campaigns are always harsh. I mean, it's a nasty business. But if you look at the U.S., I mean, there was a period, if you think of the 19th century, where campaigns could be extremely vitriolic. If you think of campaigns in the post-war era, they've been relatively polite affairs within, the bounds of limits. This was an amazing campaign. I mean, Donald Trump's attacks on Megyn Kelly, blood coming out, mocking a disabled reporter, T-shirts with quasi-pornographic comments about Hillary Clinton. Something that had never been seen in the U.S., I think, in the living memory of any American alive today. But it happened. And not only it happened, but Trump got not half of the popular vote, but essentially 47%. So why is that possible today? Whereas in the old days, we would have said this is a death sentence. If you campaign like this, you're going to be confined to 1 or 2%.
Thank you, Robert. Am I on? Yeah. Okay. I want to address this, to step back a bit and look at the language of the campaign. I think that's what Robert has in mind. To my own view, what has happened, I'm a little bit idiosyncratic in thinking this way. It has something to do with where people get their information and where they get their language from. Back in the day, pre-internet, most people got their news originally from newspapers and then from TV. In an age when Walter Cronkite was the voice of reason, the voice of moderation, and the most trusted man in America, as he was called.
Maybe you could explain who Cronkite was.
Walter Cronkite was a TV news anchor, evening news show, just as perhaps in Japan 10, 15 years ago when everyone watched NHK at 9 o'clock, as I did. And that was what people talked about the next day around the water cooler, is what you heard on the evening news on TV. These days, most people that I've talked to, especially Trump voters, do not read newspapers. They get their news from the internet and especially from social media. But to go back to, say, the early 2000s, pre-social media, an interesting book by Cass Sunstein, who worked in the White House and teaches at Harvard now, he did some research that showed that people on the internet tend to fall into chat rooms and bulletin boards and only end up in echo chambers. They only hear what they want to say. And this becomes a stovepiping and it leads people to extreme judgments and extreme opinions because they don't hear the other side. It's gotten a lot worse in the last 5 years because social media has now taken hold. And people who are getting their information from the Ann Coulters and Rush Limbaugh's and Breitbart, for example, that worked on the people with Breitbart who are now were involved in the campaign for Donald Trump. The language is extremely vicious. Extremely one-sided, and it's brutal. It's obscene. It's a little bit like if you look at the comments, not just on the major newspapers, but if you like YouTube like I do, you really don't want to look in the comment section where the trolls are, because these trolls they trade in obscenity in that sort of language, and there's a huge arrogance because they don't allow any counter views. They don't manage to get on the pages. And I call this, it's been dubbed the alt-right. Those who are the farthest to the right in this social media world, who are trading in racism and in hatred of all different sorts. And this language has, to some degree, been part of the Trump campaign, and the people who deal in that world, in that language, are not offended by the language of their candidate.
Follow up to Miya with kind of two short questions. Japanese campaigns are, by American standards, fairly tame. Political styles are tamer. Do you think that the verbal violence of this campaign kind of shocked people like you students? And also, having lived and studied in the United States and California, is this something that you find surprising in terms of the way the United States has evolved? Is that something you would have expected when you were a graduate student in America, that one day you'd see these types of campaigns?
You can have a moment to reflect on that.
Yeah. Well, it might not be a direct answer to a question, but well, one thing I noticed among my students' reaction to Trump rhetoric, when I assigned them to read the first presidential debate script, whatever the Trump said about Japan is so anachronistic, too outdated, and they don't get the word behemoth. Did you remember the word Trump described Japan as behemoth? Behemoth. Do I pronounce right? Behemoth.
That's me.
Behemoth. And that's a monstrous, powerful and fearful figure. And they just don't get it because they are millenniums. They were born after bubble burst, and they don't remember the years that I used to be a graduate student at UCLA. That's when Japan bashing was so heated, and Michael Crichton's Rising Sun was popular, and Japan was #1 as also a very popular book. So they just don't get the sense that why Trump used the word behemoth to us. Aren't we Pokemon instead of behemoth? So that's what they, see themselves as very, soft power Japan, not like aggressive invader, Japan bashing and Japan as a, Japan is like buying out the America symbolical Rockefeller Center and stuff. So I didn't expect this would happen, but I didn't either expect the first African American president would become a reality in 2008. Back then, when I was at the UCLA, it was like almost like a decade ago, 2 decades ago, or 3 decades ago, to be honest. So that was also unthinkable. So both are unthinkable. But,
Well, Prime Minister Abe, I think, wants to go and meet with Trump next week. I don't know if I envy the interpreter. I think a good interpreter interprets and adjusts. So I think whoever gets this job from Guy Mouchot will want to interview him on the record. So, Ken, you've mentioned the roots of some of this support. Who did he appeal to? I mean, when he announced his candidacy, no one thought that he would get the Republican nomination. He did. When he ran for president, it seemed so absurd. And okay, he lost by a very thin margin the popular vote, but he won the Electoral College, which matters. Even a third of Americans who have graduate degrees voted for him. So how come?
Well, when you posed this question to me, I wanted to address what I consider the base. That is the largest, most loyal part of his following of the voting for Trump. And it's funny, I'm going to read a little short passage, if you'll bear with me. It's a book review of a book by James Webb, who actually was my first candidate. Before he dropped out, he was a Democratic candidate for president.
Maybe you could explain his background.
James Webb is a novelist. Very early, he was gifted. He was a Secretary of the Navy when he was young in the Reagan administration. Comes from a Scots-Irish family. And the book that he wrote is about the Scots-Irish. And in the book, the book review describes them as a force in America, the largest cultural force in America. Let me just read it to you in a moment, and I think you'll see what I'm getting at. The review starts this way. The book, James Webb's book, helps explain why Democrats must take note if they wish to remain relevant in American politics. Scots-Irish are a force that shapes our culture. A fierce and uncomplaining, self-reliant, already hardened people when they came from the islands. To them, it makes no sense for the government to take their guns, and nobody's going to take their guns. These are the red state voters, family-oriented, take morality seriously, go to church, join the military, support America's wars, and listen to country music. They strongly believe that no man is obligated to obey the edicts of a government that violates his moral conscience. They once formed the bedrock of the Democratic Party from the time of Andrew Jackson. They have been moving to the Republicans ever since. Individualistic, rebellious, people who, from their origins in the mists of northern Scotland, to the highlands of America, and to the far west, refuse to bend the knee to king, bishop, or modern American elites, very anti-elitist. This is culture, not blood. The Scots-Irish culture is so populist and assimilative that other ethnic groups have gravitated toward it. Accordingly, it is arguably America's strongest cultural force. They are either invisible or objects of derision, because in today's group identity politics, the Scots-Irish are usually lumped into the WASP category. They're ridiculed by the coastal elites as hillbillies, ignorant, racist, violence-prone rednecks, trailer park trash, or crackers. Charles Krauthammer, a very right-wing Washington Post columnist, called them white trash vote by pandering to rebel, yell, racist rednecks. This is on the Republican side. They get it from both sides. And James Webb wrote back in the Wall Street Journal, this is the most vicious ethnic slur of the presidential campaign, noting that Krauthammer, quote, never complained about this ethnic group when it is marched off to fight the wars he wishes upon us. Studies have shown that the ethnic status of the Scots-Irish is similar to that of black Southerners, but since they are lumped in with other non-ethnic whites, they do not benefit from affirmative action. But all America's elites see are rednecks waving the Confederate flag. If the Democrats ever want to be competitive in American politics again, they need to figure out a way to appeal to Scots-Irish culture that essentially co-evil with the red states.
Thanks. That was very interesting. And for those of you interested, it's worth looking at Jim Webb's biography. He was also a Marine Corps officer, Navy Cross winner, considered, I think, an outstanding junior officer. Went through a difficult return to the U.S. and became a famous novelist, senator. I'd like to
the book is called Born Fighting, by the way.
Born Fighting, yeah. That's Joshua. You worked on Capitol Hill. Any thoughts from the? Now we've heard the outsider point of view, the Scots-Irish.
Right.
Let's hear it from the establishment.
Well, one of the clear things is that Donald Trump's support did not come from Capitol Hill. That is without Capitol Hill. His support amongst establishment Republicans was very low.
Maybe we should explain Capitol Hill as well.
Capitol Hill is Washington, D.C., so the Congress, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. And I worked for a number of years on the Democratic side on Capitol Hill. And it's no secret that Donald Trump's support came from his populist stances, and as Ken mentioned, from people who felt that they were disenfranchised. It's probably useful, though I wouldn't completely trust the polls this year, to look at some of the initial numbers compared to, say, the 2012 election between President Obama and Mitt Romney. So, for example, you have the female vote. Hillary Clinton probably will not, despite winning the popular vote and losing the Electoral College, which is the way that people attain the presidency through a state voting system in the United States, have won more women than President Obama did. Among men, Donald Trump did significantly better, 7% higher than Mitt Romney. College-educated people as a whole voted for Hillary Clinton, but without a degree, she only did the same as Obama. And 2/3, so pushing 70% of non-college educated whites, as Ken has mentioned, supported Donald Trump. The young, as President Obama, always said, "Are you fired up and ready to go?" These people stayed home, and that's the reason she lost the election. People stayed home. There's not a secret group of Trump supporters that are out there who are some type of Nixon phenomenon of the silent majority or shy Trump supporters. People simply stayed home, okay? And that is why, in the end, she lost the election. With one other caveat, this was supposed to be an election where Latinos would define themselves as the pivotal voting bloc for now and for the future. My own personal belief is that the Democratic Party, despite this stinging loss, is still on the ascendancy in terms of how the demographics of the country are going to shape out over the next 10, 20, and 30 years. But Hillary Clinton, despite all the awful and nasty things that Donald Trump said about Latinos, in fact, kicking off his campaign with really terrible comments about Mexicans, only won 65% of the Latino vote. And that's 5 to 10 points shy of President Obama. So I think that's where his support came from. It definitely wasn't from Capitol Hill.
Thank you. And you're an historian. You know, it's interesting, the United States is often viewed as a young country, but in a way it has a very old political history that's uninterrupted. I mean, the first presidential election took place in 1788 during the Tenmei era in Japan. Louis XVI was king of France, though I hope he was enjoying it at the time because he didn't have many years left on the throne. And since then, the United States has had a presidential election every 4 years, uninterrupted, same schedule.
And only one republic.
And only one republic. And maybe the last. And so, how do you look at this as an historian with a long-range view? It's on.
Well, what I was going to say, Robert, is that historians work slowly, and I've been reading a lot on the pundits, so I'm going to think a little bit about the way the elections have played through some of the commentaries. But if I could just say really quickly in response to some of what Ken said, I've spent the last several months reading a lot to try to figure out what was going on in the United States. And I'm going to give you a reading list really fast because I'm a teacher. Yeah. Nancy Eisenberg's Poor White Trash, Jane Mayer's Dark Money, journalist Elizabeth Colbert's Sixth Extinction, Harvard sociologist Matthew Desmond's Evicted, Poverty and Profit in an American City, and sociologist Arlie Hochschild on the Trump supporters in Louisiana, Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. These... I will. No, these books are actually really essential sort of diagnostic tools. I mean, for me, they were kind of my masochist summer reading as I tried to think about what Robert used to call Plan T when we first arrived in Tokyo. And I thought, oh, maybe I don't need one, but I better get ready. So these were the books. I can send them to Robert, and he can send them out to all of you. I also read a lot of Tocqueville over the summer, so this again is what made me think about the fragile instability of the American experiment. So, what elections, and how did the elections play out through how people tried to diagnose what was going on? The election of 1800 figured a lot in the pundits' commentary about the ways in which a peaceful transfer of power between two different opposing parties worked. The elections of 1824 and 1828 offered two different kinds of lessons about a bitter campaign between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. The election of 1860, for the darkest days when people said, okay, if we're going to turn to violence, here's an election where we really did turn to violence after Lincoln was elected and the South seceded. The election of 1896, which again had a populist play in it and was also often analyzed as another election that took place during an era of a media transformation. This was the era of the big Pulitzer, yellow journalism. So the press played a different kind of role in the election of 1896, the election of McKinley, than it had before. The election of 1912 with Theodore Roosevelt's third party operation. The election of 1940 with Charles Lindbergh's fascist move on the outside. The election of 1960 for a media, once again, a media transformation. The election of 1968 for a kind of pattern of political violence playing out on the American streets. And finally, the election of 2000. In the aftermath of day before yesterday's election. We've also seen people turn to the election of 1948 and the miscall around Truman and Dewey. I mean, probably any of you who've studied American politics know the famous headline of Truman holding the paper of Dewey's victory. I don't know what to do with all this, because every time the historians or the pundits use this list of elections, they wind up conjuring weird things, like that John Quincy Adams was called a pimp for trying to sell his babysitter to the Tsar of Russia, and that Chester A. Arthur, when he was Garfield's vice president candidate, was rumored to have been born in Canada. Like Ted Cruz. So that people then stop and say, it's without precedent. Some of my historian friends have also begun to play that game that historians do, not of the best president, but looking for the worst presidents. And they pull out James Buchanan and Herbert Hoover, arguing that here are two men who were touted as two of the best prepared candidates America had ever come up with, and two of them became failed presidents. So maybe we're not so bad with an ill-prepared candidate, as they try to make us feel slightly better. So I'll stop there on the elections.
And Louis, I have just a very short question for you, and then a very short question for everybody else, and we'll turn it to our anxious listeners. You've been teaching at Tokyo University. Have you taught a class since this happened?
No, but I taught a class I teach on Mondays,
so
I taught last Monday, and one of the students said a couple of things that were very interesting. One raised the question of the hatred of Hillary Clinton. She has a Japanese mother and a Russian father. She's very bicultural, very bilingual, I guess trilingual. But her question was, she could not decipher the hatred. She could not figure out where the cemented hatred had come from and why it was unmovable. Another student had spent 2 weeks in September in New York and said, how can you people stand this for so long? He said, I was sick of the election after 2 weeks. So but I actually tried to reassure my students as I tried to find a set of cultural touchstones that they had in common, and I could only think of Men in Black. So I have this sort of abiding faith, like an American optimist, that the ship of our democratic state would right itself. And I said, well, don't worry about the ugliness of this campaign. It's kind of like Men in Black. You have Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith, and they're going around policing these aliens who look like normal human beings, and they start to misbehave, and then their alien self comes out, and they drop their human masks, and Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith come in, and they make them look like humans again. I said, so don't worry, the United States will put its human face back on after Tuesday's election. So actually, I'm not sure how I'm going to face them on Monday, since the our alien self has come out. So.
Is this, if we look at this, and you kind of alluded to this, Joshua, is this kind of the last stand of the Trump coalition? Is this really revolutionary? That is, if you look at the demographics, if you look at the politics, who was for him, who was for it, is this real change, the way, say, Roosevelt managed to really change the balance of power in American politics, or is this a last stand of the angry white man?
It's a very good question. My immediate answer would be that in the long term, yes, it is. Whether that happens in 4 years, in 8 years, or 12 years is a little bit difficult to predict. As we've seen in the last 2 months, even an election is extremely difficult to predict, and the future is very difficult to predict. And all the powers that be were wrong. But make no mistake, what Hillary Clinton was trying to do was something that is extremely difficult, and it's particularly difficult for the Democratic Party. It's only happened twice. Once when Martin Van Buren, our Canadian friend, perhaps, succeeded Andrew Jackson, and the second time was when Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran for an unprecedented third term. Hillary Clinton, no. It happened when he ran for his third, but right, and then he won a fourth. And so she was trying to not only shatter the glass ceiling, but break into what is a very exclusive club. But the reality right now is that you have a coalition that we've really never seen before, because we're going to have to figure out whether or not Donald Trump rules as a populist with a conservative coalition in the House of Representatives and the Senate, or whether the Republicans simply do just have all the levers of power, which would be complete when he gets to make what probably will be 2 to 3 Supreme Court justice nominations within the next few years. So the short-term answer is that there was, as many people have described it, some type of white lash, where there's now a realization amongst a certain part of American society that it's going to be a majority-minority country within the next 20 to 30 years, and that is a fact. But in the long term, I think it's unquestionable that the demographic changes in the United States favor the Democratic Party.
Yeah, let's hope. Yeah. Just a few words. Is this revolutionary or
Revolutionary.
or do you think it's an accident?
Well, some of my students, I happened to have a class yesterday, 2 classes and 1 seminar, and one of my students said that probably Americans couldn't stand two big changes in a row. One was in 2008, was first African American president, and now female president. It was already too much, and now a female president is unthinkable. So then they goes like, so the racism, maybe misogyny comes into play with this election. Yes, but in the long run, I think demographically, the Hispanics and Asian, I'm a census historian myself, so I'm not necessarily following very modern newest information on the census figure, but as far as I know, Asian immigration is fastest growing population in terms of immigrants coming in, just slightly over Hispanics. So then if the Asian population will be growing, since it's the fastest growing immigrant population now already, so if you have the Hispanic, or I would rather say Latino or brown, Mexican Hispanic population combined with Asian population, and so the people of color kind of coalition will be more mobilized in the long run. I think this election might be a dustbin of the history.
Can I say one thing? Yeah, and very briefly, and then we'll turn to questions.
Very quickly, historians traffic in unintended consequences. We tell stories and we look at unintended consequences. So if I can look backward rather than predicting, I think there are 3 really major things that are important here about the unintended consequences long term. One is the media transformation that I've already mentioned. The other one is the tragic dysfunction of our legislature. Historians who look at the coming of fascism in Italy and Germany in particular look at the way in which a dysfunctional Congress actually introduced the opportunity for certain kinds of demagogic leadership. I think we're facing that as well. And I think the third thing is the tragic destruction of U.S. public higher education, and that this produces that famous coalition of uncollege educated voters. I don't think there's ever been an election where this has been an identifiable coalition. But if you look back at the long, slow erosion of a libertarian project to undo the federal government, the destruction of public higher education is a really major part of that. And I think we're watching the consequences of what had been a kind of engine of hope in the 40s and 50s, kind of be, and 40s, 50s, and 60s, kind of be shut off and destroyed for a generation. So that's my long-term unintended consequences.
I'll try to be yay briefer. Yay briefer. the phrase "angry white man's last stand" has close parallels to the election of Barack Obama. The angry white man is angry that he's losing his country, and he's not a champion of multiculturalism. 8 years ago, when Barack Obama came into office, the angry black man was supposed to wither away. We were going to see the post-racial society. That didn't happen. They did not turn against Barack Obama, but they did. Racial relations took a turn for the worse. So if that can be a guide, perhaps the angry white man will turn against the rest of society, the elites, and not against their champion in the White House.
Well, thank you very much. I will now open the floor. So I think the procedure is, if you have a question, you can walk up to the mic, and it's kind of a democracy, but it's a guided democracy, which we've reached a conclusion that's really the best way to run things. So raise your hand, and then we'll call up. Okay, so you raise your hand first with a red T-shirt, okay, and then we have a hand that's hidden that will go over there, and then.
Hello. So I had a bit of a question on a couple of the last issues. You mentioned things like white lash and uneducated white voters. Seeing as 50% of educated whites voted for Donald Trump and about 90% of uneducated whites voted for Donald Trump, you have a number of political correspondents like Van Jones claiming that there's a white lash going on in America. And I guess my question is two parts. Do you think that is true? And the second part would be, how does this differ from white reactions during the Reconstruction era, where you have the reinstitution of de jure segregation?
Actually, the comparison to Reconstruction is pretty interesting. And I mean, as I said, I haven't read the last kind of breakdowns of these polls. Whether or not you watch voting fall completely along racial lines, I think is part of what you're asking about. Nancy Eisenberg's Poor White Trash really takes this long view. It's similar to what Ken was saying about what is the coalition of this sort of white group that we've marked as poor white trash, and how do they stand as a voting bloc. I don't actually know the precise answer to your question, but if you look at the ways in which the white coalitions, I do know a little bit about Reconstruction and about intentional black disfranchisement, which is the other piece of what you're looking at here, is minority voter suppression. And this was actually explicitly acknowledged in a couple of the emails of the Trump campaign. And I think you're going to find parallels for this about what happens with. Okay, how much do you want to know about Reconstruction? So. In Eric Foner's magisterial book on Reconstruction, which is really a reworking of W.E.B. Du Bois's magisterial book, Black Reconstruction from the 1930s, both of them are arguing for really engaged black political power, that the former slaves were actively engaged in shaping sort of local politics and local electoral politics, and that the move against them and the retention of white power can be understood in a couple of different ways. One is a local one, and the real tragic side was the pullout of the Republican Party in the North, from supporting the sort of interracial coalitions that were envisioned in the most optimistic moments of Reconstruction. So why did they do that? What is the logic behind that? There are a couple of different readings for that, if you really want a history lesson. And it really has to do about capital expansion, that the wealthy white Northerners saw their economic interests fueled by the returns of white planter power, from labor lords to landlords. So, God, okay, if you were going to really have a more just and interracial society in the post-war South, you would have distributed the land. I mean, 40 acres and a mule was not an outrageous demand for the enslaved people who created the wealth of that society. That didn't happen, but because that didn't happen, you never had a full kind of economic equality or economic opportunity, and you can run that through history. Why black communities didn't share the rise of real estate wealth that characterized most other communities in the United States can be traced right back to that you can do it through redlining, you can do it through proprietary racially designated lending, but you can also find a kind of longer historical pattern there. I'm sorry.
That was great.
I'm sorry, I don't think I really answered you. I may just have confused you, but yes, there are parallels there. I'll leave it at that.
I think we'll go to the next question. You'd raised your hand, so I saw you first, and it's okay. Okay, then I can already feel that not everybody will get to ask a question. I'm sorry about this, but we can't have the room until 9 in the morning.
Okay, I just wanted to say thank you first, and then I want to address something which I didn't see, which is I think it's quite obvious why Hillary Clinton lost, but no one's addressed it clearly yet, except for when we talked about the dysfunction of the legislature. So how does systemic corruption of the government and also paired with that, the shift of tax burdens from the corporations to the people, the general population, where corporations, I think, are paying about 13% in taxes, whereas the general population is paying 30% or more. So how do those two factors play into the reason that Hillary Clinton lost? Thank you.
I would say something very briefly. Very briefly, that I don't want to accept that the government is inherently corrupt until we define corruption, because I've lived in a lot of countries overseas where the Transparency Index, Transparency International Index, corruption levels are up here in the US, Switzerland, and so on are a lot lower. There is the perception, the public perception of great unfairness, rigged system, and corruption. That's true. And I think perhaps more openness would address that problem.
Okay, Meguro-san. Yes. I'm sorry, we're new to using this space. We're having so many persons, so maybe before we'll ask you to take kind of a ticket if you want to ask questions, so we can have something that's fair, but right now it's not totally fair. But
thank you very much. And I have a very simple question. But, who is or who are responsible for the result of the election this time? Politicians or media or someone else?
Take a shot. So, as I understand the question, you've asked who is responsible for the loss, correct? And as always, when somebody prefaces their question by saying that they're asking a simple question, it's definitely not a simple question. That's for sure, all the time. Well, first of all, Hillary Clinton has apologized, so she must feel that she has let people down in some respect. I would say that one of the things that is a key contributing factor is that there was probably too much complacency in the Clinton campaign. The models that were built and the models that were used to try and predict what was going to happen and how they needed to get out the vote and how they needed to replicate President Obama's famous grassroots organizing campaigns were based mostly on what happened in 2012. And a lot happens in 4 years. And so those models were not updated to reflect the changes and the feelings of being disenfranchised that exist even during a period of economic recovery. And so while I spoke with somebody in the Trump campaign yesterday who said that they had their own model, that it was basically copied from the famous Obama models in terms of how to get out the vote, what type of numbers they were getting in terms of whether or not President-elect Trump, which is what we call him now, would win. They were slightly different, but they still didn't have him coming out on top. So I believe this combination of complacency and the failure of the models probably was the biggest contributing factor.
Thanks. I think to answer this question very quickly, I think when a result is so close, the politician who lost is responsible for it. I think it's as simple as this. I mean, I say this as somebody who supported Hillary Clinton. I think if you lose by what is overall a very small margin, it's your fault. You didn't do as good a job. I mean, it's that's life. Yeah.
the media is also partly to blame because it gave Donald Trump a free ride in the primaries. It was unique in American politics to have not just a candidate who attracts media interest, but he was a celebrity, he was a hugely popular TV celebrity, and who gets to meet a billionaire. This attracted the media, and they lost all sense of proportion and balance in covering him so overwhelmingly. It's been documented.
Okay, a question from the far left, I mean, geographically speaking.
Okay, many of us, I think in Japan, are quite concerned about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the Japanese Diet is prepared to pass. There was some speculation that the lame duck session would pass it before Hillary was inaugurated, but that doesn't seem to be the case. What's the likelihood, and this is for Joshua really, because he's the Beltway insider, what's the likelihood that Donald Trump can rebrand it as the Trump-Pacific Partnership? And the second part of this is a Japanese two-part question is, when does Hillary present herself to the federal marshals to begin serving her sentence? And can she get Lompoc, California, which is apparently a pretty nice place?
I will pivot and deflect on question 2 and revert back to question 1 about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. As you indicated, Senate Majority Leader and who will continue to be the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, indicated today or yesterday that the TPP would not be considered in the lame duck session. Obviously, one of the rallying points was of the Trump campaign was to dismantle trade deals across the world. So not only trade deals involving a dozen countries in the TPP, but TTIP, neither of which have been signed, NAFTA, and perhaps even pulling out of the WTO. I do not think, as much as he is unquestionably an expert in branding, that this will be high on the agenda of the Trump administration. And if Hillary Clinton had won, I certainly think that even though she tried to have it both ways during the campaign, arguing in favor of TPP when she was Secretary of State, and then reacting to Trump's position on TPP when she was running for president, that it probably would have reemerged in some type of different form. But I don't think that's the case now. This deal is already on life support, and it's probably dead. And I'm not answering question number 2.
I can go without a mic if that's okay.
Well, it depends. If you want to be recorded for posterity, you have to use the mic.
Hi, good evening. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I found out about it late today. I'm so happy that you mentioned that you think the person who loses is responsible. But back, and I think, Joshua, you're probably going to feel this one again. Michael Moore, the documentary filmmaker, had a presentation several months ago, and he was talking about Donald Trump's, one of his strategies was to approach the Rust Belt. And if you don't know what the Rust Belt is, that's the Northeast United States that's very heavy in industry, steel, cars, all kinds of heavy industry. And that was one of his strategies, was to go there. Michael Moore predicted that Donald Trump would win largely based on that strategy and others. But he wrote a rather lengthy Facebook post today. And part of that Facebook post was that the popular vote, and Joshua, you mentioned this, the popular vote went to Hillary Clinton. So, Robert, you mentioned that the loser is the person who's responsible for the loss. However, and this is where the question comes in, Hillary Clinton did not lose the vote. She lost the presidency by virtue of the system. So here's the question. Should we be focused on changing the system, meaning the Electoral College, so that we can actually elect a person? Now with the technology we have, the purpose of the Electoral College is pretty much gone. I think a lot of people agree with that. But can you address it from the point of, if we didn't have the Electoral College, did she really lose?
I'll answer it quickly, and maybe Stone wants to fetch it. First, if you train for sumo and you lose to Muhammad Ali because you didn't know that it was actually a boxing match, No, it's kind of your fault. I mean, everybody knew that there's an electoral college. The problem is the math of the electoral college overrepresents the smaller states. So if you move to a one person, one vote, more states would lose than would gain if you look just at the plain math. And because of the constitutional amendment that's required, that would be impossible, because you would not only would most states lose, but the states that would lose an enormous amount, because the really small states of population like Wyoming or Delaware or Washington, D.C. is not a state, but it's an electoral entity for this purpose. Instead of having 3 votes, we essentially have 1. They would lose 60 to, in some cases, 70% of their voting power. The larger states like California would gain 2 or 3%. So you have a situation where there are more losers than winners, and where the winners win very little, but the losers lose a lot. And anybody who's familiar with politics know that's a no-win situation. Anybody want to add something?
Well, I'll just say one other thing. I mean, this comes up every 4 years, that why do we have this anachronistic system? Why can't we go to direct democracy? So I won't say anything more than that, except that our Constitution, the founding fathers, had lots of checks about direct democracy. They didn't want direct democracy. They didn't trust it. Yeah, and they didn't think it would work. So, I mean, this may be counterproductive, and there may be a way, although in a Trump administration, it seems unlikely that there will be a groundswell to introduce a constitutional amendment to amend the Electoral College, since it fell to his benefit.
Yes, here. And then you're in the back. You'll be right. Yeah, you're
Hi,
next.
I'm
Yeah.
Robert. Thank you very much for coming today. My question was, differences between Trump's polling numbers and Romney's polling numbers, because they yielded quite a few interesting results. Namely, that Trump, at least percentage-wise, actually polled worse among white Americans overall than Romney did, but he actually polled better among Mexicans, Latinos like myself, and black individuals than Romney did. How do you suppose that came about?
You are a historian of ethnicity too, or anybody who wants to?
I'll take a shot. This is a fascinating question. In 2012, you might know that being the keen businessman that he is, that Mitt Romney, who lost the election in 2012 to President Obama, commissioned a study and had the RNC commission a study where they interviewed 50,000 people about what it is that they needed to do. And much like this night tonight is a post-mortem of the election results, Romney encouraged the party to do a post-mortem of why he lost. He lost in large part because their model was slightly flawed in terms of, that even though they knew they were going to lose the African-American vote, they didn't realize that President Obama would really get 95 or 96% of that vote, which is just an extraordinary number that we're probably never going to see again. So there are a lot of people scratching their heads because that post-mortem offered up a playbook. Reince Priebus, who is the chairman of the Republican National Committee, urged the campaigns and the party to follow this as a way to win the White House. And all we know right now is that Donald Trump doesn't have a lot of incentive to follow those types of rules, because he beat 16 or 17 other people in the Republican primaries, and he just captured the White House by playing by his own rules. So why he was able to do that is still a bit of a mystery. It's an excellent question, but he also got a much higher percentage of women than anybody ever predicted. So this is really part of the problem. I would go back to the one point that I made before to conclude, which is that those people who voted didn't necessarily come out in larger numbers for Donald Trump. It's Clinton supporters who stayed home.
Indeed. Thank you for answering my question.
Yeah, you had a question. You're coming. Good.
This is related to the Clinton reporters staying home, but as a nation that just elected a man who his foundation was actually ordered to stop operating, a federal lawsuit against him, accused of sexual assault by multiple women, versus Clinton, who is called corrupt even by people in this room, even though nothing has been proven, despite multiple investigations. The there was a quote I saw last night that we learned yesterday, Americans are much more sexist and misogynist than racist. What do you have to say about that? 'Cause it's like, what do you think about that? I feel like a lot of it is people just don't want to vote for the whole, sexism in America and the workplace and politics has been a really big thing, especially this year with the rape cases and all of that. And I personally think that played a big part, but you don't see a lot of men addressing that topic.
Yeah. And I'd like to kind of follow up with this question. I think if you'd asked most political scientists or historians 10 years ago, what's easier, a black man or a white woman as president? I think most would have said a white woman.
I
wondering,
don't know. I'm not so sure. I think it's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure how to answer it, but I'll make it. Well, the question really was, how does a sexism or misogyny play through this election? How are we judging what the play is about contemporary sexual politics, rape on campus, the way we're thinking now about sex and women's power? Is that a fair caricature of your question?
Yeah, and
Okay.
just general sexism in America.
I mean, I guess one of the things that's very interesting here, and it goes back to the way the polls and the predictions work. I think it's really difficult to measure sexism, and I think part of the Trump support that was hidden from the polls is I think a lot of people weren't going to say that they were going to support him. I was stunned actually that he got as many votes from women as he did. I can't for the life of me figure this out. If you look at the way women's voting has worked politically, it's so interesting to me that. So women first asked for the vote in 1849 at Seneca Falls. It took 70 years before women were granted the vote. So the first presidential election was 1920. There was a 17-year-old girl who'd been at the Seneca Falls meeting, and she cast her vote in 1920. So why that opposition ran for that long is kind of astonishing in a country that had gradually extended the suffrage, first to propertyless white men, then to African-American men. Why there was this obstacle about women. And I think Clinton was I think what your other point, which is really interesting, is that the allegations of corruption against Clinton were probably fueled by sexism, that they became a mask or a beard to dismiss her qualifications because she was a woman. So rather than being able to say, I'm not going to vote for you because you're a woman, it's I'm not going to vote for you because you are the embodiment of corruption. And the fact that she was unable, I think she had a very narrow behavior path, which is the other thing. When I could not believe that second debate. She was astonishing in those debates. But if she had behaved in one way, she could have tipped into a version of the angry black man that Obama was always up against, the shrill, nasty talking woman with a high mean voice, the evil boss, the witch. All of those caricatures were lurking in the shadows, ready to fall down on her. So I think we're a long way still from, although, as somebody put it optimistically, the first woman president was in the audience somewhere in the country yesterday watching Hillary Clinton's speech. So that's my optimistic read for you. Maybe it's you.
Yeah, very far in the back. You're here. You raise your hand. Yeah, good. And then we're kind of moving around.
Hello, thank you for being here today. The First Amendment to the United States Constitution says this Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the exercise thereof. It goes on. When all three branches of our government are being run now by the Conservative Party, what does that mean for the human rights of Muslims, of gay and trans people, of brown people in general?
Very interesting question. I think you have a lot of people that are quite scared right now, to be completely blunt about it. There are a lot of people who are worried that they may not belong in the country anymore They may not be able to come to the country anymore, and that's not overstating anything if the president-elect has said that Muslims should stop coming to the country until we figure what the hell's going on. So for people of color, for people who are gay, or for other people who feel disenfranchised due to the election results, they're going to have to work really double down their efforts and work hard to try and change the electoral makeup starting in the midterm elections in 2 years, and then look 4 years down the road to try and change the occupant of the White House. What is probably the most influential and critical factor here, though, is that right now you have a Supreme Court without a ninth member. Merrick Garland is not going to get a hearing in the lame duck Congress, and so that third branch of government that you referred to earlier is probably going to shift heavily in a very conservative way, and that's what I'd be most concerned about for the groups that you mentioned.
I would say, alluding or riffing off of that remark just there, it's not so much that we have unified as opposed to divided government, it's that there's going to be a very conservative government in place for the next 4 years. But you have to keep in mind that the Pew Trust, which tracks American opinions on gays and sexual attitudes and racial attitudes, that American attitudes have changed drastically over the past 20 years or so. In 2012, if I got the date right, a plurality, that is 50%, more than 50% of Americans said they would accept gay unions, and now they would accept gay marriage. And this is something which even Obama was saying he was, moving on? He was he was evolving on, and well, just attitudes have changed very quickly.
You know, what's interesting, I mean, religious views, and is that it's another way in which, in a way, Trump broke the playbook. I mean, the assumption was to win the Republican nomination, you had to be somewhat socially conservative. He had a life that is generally considered by most social conservatives to have been incompatible with being a Christian gentleman. That's putting it, because we don't want to have an R-rated session here. It's interesting, I was pointing out, I mean, seriously, to a friend of mine, the two people always mentioned as possible senior appointees in the administration, are Newt Gingrich and Rudy Giuliani, who, like with Trump, share a history of open adultery. And I've always wondered whether Mike Pence will be forced to take on a mistress if he wants to be admitted into the inner circle of the Trump family. But it is, but I think, no, seriously, you raise an important question that goes to the core of this issue, is that Trump ran a race-baiting campaign. Now, that's not unique in the history of American history, and that's not unique to Republicans. I mean, Democrats have done it. There's a difference between dog whistling and doing it in a frontal assault. Everybody's done dog whistle. I mean, on race, on gender, on politics, on everything, on age, on what have you. I mean, that's the nature of politics. But the frontal assault is not new. I mean, something obviously you had a few decades ago, but we haven't seen it in mainstream Republican politics or mainstream Democratic politics really probably since George Wallace left the Democratic Party. Any other questions? Okay, so we have one over here in the back. Yeah, the person just behind you. Yeah, here. Yeah.
So during the election, we had Trump criticize Hillary Clinton, 30 years, all talk, no action. Now Donald Trump's got his chance to take action, right? Is he going to build a wall? Is he going to lock her up? Is he going to provide 15% taxes for everyone? What of all the things that he said do you actually believe he's going to do?
Well, I don't know if anybody wants even to take a crack at this.
I did read an article by Evan Osnos in the New Yorker that from July, I think, but it's available now on the website, that tries to talk about exactly that. That's my suggestion.
Very briefly, first of all, it's a very important point. I personally found that line of attack to be very effective. Why didn't you do anything about it? Some people disagree with that. I thought it was quite effective. Obviously, he's in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue right now, so other people must agree. There are some areas where there's probably going to be movement. Obviously, with the House and Senate in Republican control, a top priority is the repeal or some type of reorganization of Obamacare. There may be some movement and or common ground on infrastructure spending, some type of massive, jolt to the economy to build roads, bridges, etc. Airports would be a good thing. And where we know that there might also be some problematic areas that the new Trump administration would move on would be tariffs. He's threatened to slap 45% tariffs on imported goods from China. Trade seems to be a bit of a non-starter. He wants to unravel the Iranian nuclear deal. And there's been this bromance between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump that's been going on for so long. We're all waiting with bated breath to find out whether or not that is going to happen. So those issues, plus inaction on climate change and changes to the Supreme Court, would be where I'd look first.
Just to quickly comment, the plausible and realistic option that Trump might take is to ask Japan to have more share to the bases in Japan. So I think, it's really unrealistic for him to ask or build a war paid by Mexican government, but to ask Japanese government to pay for the military bases here sound very realistic option for him to take to realize his promise during the campaign.
Just briefly, it's hard to get things done in the government. We've had gridlock. Obama got things done in the first couple of years, but he did have a complete control of the House and Senate. So maybe in the first couple of years, if there are not changes in the first off-election, by-election. But for all the, not so many, but people I know that voted for Trump, I'd like to say that, how would you feel if you're, say, a garage mechanic and someone comes in your garage and says, everything you're doing is a disaster, everything is stupid, everything is wrong, and only I can fix it? So Trump is coming into the government with no government experience and thinks he's going to snap his fingers and get things done. I'm not sure how easy it'll be for him.
I think one challenge, obviously, is that he has no track record in public service. The other thing is, in a bipolar system, every coalition includes internal conflicts. If you think of the FDR coalition, Southern whites committed to segregation, urban blacks, if you're a political genius, sometimes you can hold them together. I think Roosevelt fits in that category. Sometimes very difficult. I mean, one problem that the Democrats had is that the Bill Clinton brand of Democratic Party, something that happened in the UK, say with Tony Blair, believed that the Democrats had to gain credibility with Wall Street, with wealthy voters, and as a result, they set into action policies that displeased the working class. And they lost the white element of the working class because really the black element of the working class didn't have anywhere to go given the nature of the Republican Party. The problem with Trump is that he has promises that are extremely incompatible with one another. You have on the one hand, you have a Republican Party that is now, if you think of Paul Ryan, committed to fiscal retrenchment, spend less, tax less. And that's the sort of policies which Republicans and to some extent Democrats have advocated for a long time. The first thing you do to your poor Scots-Irish voters is tell them, look, we've got great news, guys. People who are earning more than $500,000 a year are going to pay fewer taxes. Capital gains taxes gone. Well, if you're a working class guy, it doesn't really do much good to you because you're unlikely, if you're making $500,000, you're not in that category. You're not a working class voter by definition. So it's very, very difficult to see what he will do because in some cases, what he wants to do, what the Republicans want, is just incompatible. And what we also don't know is that not only it's a man who has never served in public office, but even his private sector career, I mean, he starts with a lot of money. So he's not a Bill Gates, a Steve Jobs who builds something. So we have no idea whether he's used to the work rhythm. That's it. I mean, being president is a very demanding job. You know, if you talk to, probably if you meet like the CEO of General Electric, this is a guy who probably works extraordinarily hard. We have no idea if Trump is used to that sort of working style. He has a business that's actually not very big, not diverse. He has no shareholders, so if he loses money, it's not a problem. So suddenly, you know, being president is probably very entertaining for 1 minute. You know, you arrive at the Oval Office. I mean, it's cool. It's cool. And then suddenly, you have got to work extremely hard. You have very difficult decisions. You have a team that's fighting because that's inevitable, and you've got to make decisions. Okay, you're right, you're wrong. We have no idea. I'm not saying this because, as you can guess, I'm not exactly a Trump supporter, but even if I were, we can't predict how he's going to behave because he has no, as they would say in the Victorian era, he has no past. Well, I mean, he has a past in a Victorian sense. Yes, you had your hand here, and then I again apologize. Not everybody's going to have time for a question, but
I just want to push back on the idea of the anti-establishment movement, because Josh, you've said a few times, and I think you're exactly right. If you look at the way the votes broke down over the past 3 elections or so, the Republican peak basically was the same. What changed was the Democratic turnout absolutely crashed, dramatically so. So it wasn't really that people so much wanted Trump so much as they were just ambivalent about Clinton. My short line is Republicans came home and Democrats stayed home. So that there really isn't a big push for Trump, is my point. You look at the congressional races. Most incumbents kept their seats. Most incumbents that faced a strong primary challenge survived the challenge. The only 2 or 3 who didn't were 2 of them were under indictment. A couple more of them, I don't know, something weird happened. They retired, or I don't know. What's that?
3 women in the Senate, right?
There's 4, and all minorities too. So hey, silver linings. And then when you look at voter preferences on discrete policy issues like TPP or, I don't know, I focus on TPP a lot. It's dead, by the way. On those discrete issues, those discrete economic issues and so on, there's a lot more alignment between public attitudes and quote-unquote elite attitudes than I think is often discussed. So my question for you guys is, where is the anti-establishment movement reality, or is it a rationalization because that's the best any of us can do right now? And believe me, I don't have any better answers myself other than just we're going through a phase. Thank you.
Anybody want to? I mean, I think this is a very good point. And anybody want to? You don't have to. I mean, this is
one quick remark.
There's no extra honorarium if you speak more.
No, it's that the politics of anger and populism is not isolated to the United States. And so I wouldn't paint this out to be strictly an American problem, though because of America's position in the world, this is clearly the biggest example that we've ever seen of a protectionist, nationalist, nativist movement ever. And that can be combined with what we're seeing, especially in Europe, with the continuation of a backlash against center-left and center-right governments around the world, but particularly in Europe as well. So,
I think one thing that makes it, of course, a little different in the U.S. as opposed to Brexit, or the person who, of course, reminds us most of Trump is Silvio Berlusconi, with the difference that Silvio Berlusconi was a self-made billionaire, which Trump isn't, is most of the U.S. allies, whether it's Japan or the European countries, have to some extent themselves put themselves in a situation of limited sovereignty. That is, through a variety of international agreements, through a decision to spend relatively little on their national defense, what they can do is constrained either by NATO, the European Union, the alliance with the United States. They're not forced to, but that's what they've wanted to set up. The US, of course, is to some extent constrained by nothing. That's the issue. And I think one question which interesting hasn't come, and the one I would really ask if anybody has an opinion on this, is what happens in the national security field? And I'm not the concern. I think the concern is always a nuclear button. If he wakes up at 3 a.m., decides to nuke a country, it's not going to happen. I mean, there's a procedure in the U.S. You can't do it. But when there are international crises, and there always are, you can, and sometimes at the beginning of your term, you're tested by countries that maybe want to see what metal you made. You think of the EP3 incident at the beginning of the Bush presidency. I mean, that may not have been totally planned. Of course, it was an accident in the air. The decisions that have to be made already made by the president. Congress is not involved. Very few advisors are, and at one point, the buck stops here. And my question is, do any of you have thoughts about this?
Brave Ken.
I don't think I'm not posing as an expert in American security policy. I think President-elect Trump has very few ideas and very little knowledge of security, international affairs. He always claims 200 generals and so on his advisory panel. Mike Flynn, he's got Flynn. He was the director of the National DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency. So he has good advisor. I hope he will listen and learn something and not be headstrong and impetuous.
Okay, yes, you've had your hand up for a very long time. So we want to reward perseverance.
So I think I speak for many people. I'm American as well. And we're just exhausted with the whole, election cycle. And I was watching the live election results, and someone, as a pundit and a late-night television host, Stephen Colbert, said that politics was never supposed to be like this, and that the founding fathers would never imagine that the average citizen's life would be taken up so much by what the system was. He said they should be informed, but they should not be so dedicated to political issues for the whole cycle. So my first question is, what do you think about that? Do you think the founding fathers really believed that? And the second question is, did this long election cycle in the U.S., I think the U.S. has the longest election cycle of any of the major countries. Did that allow an incubation period for someone who has no political experience to actually establish himself and vault himself up and become president?
Actually, it's a really good question, and I wish I had an easy answer because I've been puzzled about the same thing, partly driven by what in the world does that money buy? I began to think that it was a self-perpetuating industry. I mean, like all of you who gave I gave $5 once to Tammy Duckworth. I've gotten, thousands of dollars worth of emails from her. I cannot believe the begging. I can't believe the begging. And when Hillary Clinton was asking me for money Monday, I thought, what are you going to do with this money now? And so I began to wonder whether or not there's an industry that actually perpetuates this long cycle. I mean, you look at somebody like the model of Canada, Justin Trudeau. I think that election took place in 6 weeks, maybe. The candidate comes. They elected a handsome man. I dreamt about him once. He was my friend. I went, oh, Justin Trudeau is my friend. How nice. So
we talk about sexism in politics. Yeah. And here it is. I mean, imagine if somebody had said this about one of the males on the panel had said this about.
She is my friend. He was just my friend. It was like we went to a parade together. But I actually find it astonishing because yesterday people were already muttering about 2020. 2020, Pence is getting ready for 2020. I thought, oh, this is hell. This is like, so I actually have not read, I mean, whatever Stephen Colbert's brilliance is, I haven't read the Founding Fathers and their thought about politics and time, but one could do that. These were astonishing young men. I'll put it that way, other than George Washington, who was slightly older. But I don't think they thought about electioneering and what an election cycle was. I think that emerged with the party system and over the course of the 19th century. So the elections of 1824 and particularly 1828 and Jackson's election become much more engaged and active elections. So one of the arguments about why women started to vote in the 1920s, why the suffrage amendment passed, was that politics ceased to be that same kind of man on the street, down in the taverns, fighting and stomping around, which was a piece of life and recreation and amusement. So I think we're living in an extended version of that, fueled by the media. But yeah, tired is right. But,
I think it's, I think you have a point. Of course, campaigning has evolved. In the beginning, there were no presidential campaigns. When Washington ran for his second term, he actually didn't run. There was an election. I think it was, in fact, unbecoming to actually campaign. So start saying, same way they did in Japan. In the Meiji era, there was significant violence during polling, especially when the suffrage was restricted. So a few votes made a difference. And you had men with, they weren't baseball bats, but similar instruments, and in the Diet as well. You had thugs inside the Diet. So the style of politics evolves. And I think the money question, I had a friend who was in politics at one point who was convinced that most of the fundraising was to fund the consultants, who then asked, and it's interesting because, Trump actually did not run a very expensive campaign at the beginning. And I think there was a belief of the Citizen United that corporate money would rule. And if there's one man who is not the candidate of corporate America, it's Donald Trump. Corporate America preferred Clinton, and within the Republican Party, they were in the anybody but Trump camp. They would have preferred Rubio, Cruz, Kasich, maybe not Ben Carson. So it's interesting that what was expected to be a wall of money from corporate America would basically buy the election of the Citizen United hasn't happened.
I just want to say that even though Colbert said that and he's an authority, but we can't really return to that sort of life that the founding fathers may have imagined, because it's the same sort of fantasy that we're going to rebuild, open up our coal mines and rebuild our factories, some sort of fantasy image of Trump. But even if the founding fathers didn't imagine it, and even if we spend too much time on these particular elections, I do think the founding fathers and the early generations did expect us to spend a lot of time on public life. They didn't have internet and games and other things which distract us. I think of Ben Franklin, who at 40 retired and put on a collar and became a full-time public servant in the sense of volunteering. And that's what they were expected to do, was to work in public affairs.
Thank you. So we don't have time for more questions, but I'd like to go around. Since we are in Japan, ask the question, what has this done for the image of the United States? So we'll go around. Maybe we'll start for man and kind of go down to Miya in 1 or 2 minutes.
I don't know what it's done to the image of the United States, but it has really depressed me, and I wandered the streets ashamed, and I will go on doing that right now. I'm embarrassed. I grew up enough with Emerson and Whitman, and that America lies in its promise of the future, and I feel like that promise has been shattered. There are more precise, less culture, soft answers to that question about trade deals and real power. But I would end by saying I just hope that the next 4 years are not as bad as we fear.
Ken, you're a public affairs expert,
yeah,
diplomat.
really.
If tomorrow you were in charge of American public diplomacy or starting Trump, how would you present this?
Well, I was at the embassy yesterday, and I think there's a lot of the same attitudes that we have, a lot of concern and worry and the rest. The slogan is "Make America Great Again." America, throughout its history, though it's had some history of some record of bumptiousness and arrogance and preaching, and Trump has said he's not going to do that. It's America first, and he's going to look after American citizens. That suggests what it really means in effect is he doesn't care about human rights overseas and other idealistic Wilsonian agenda type things. But it's the tone of what he says. It's the racism, the xenophobia, the bigotry, and that's what really shames us.
Well, the first thing that I'd say is that America is bigger than one election. And so even though this probably stings for a lot of people right now, the sun will rise tomorrow, and we will move on. As President Obama said, we're rooting for Donald Trump to succeed. And while that might sound a little bit strange at first, at the end of the day, if you do have a stake in America or the world, you have to sort of hope that that is indeed true. The second thing that I would say is that the election, in terms of America's image, has illustrated that this is a deeply divided country with major cleavages around race and education and gender. That has been a wake-up call, and unfortunately, one of the things that this could lead to will be my final point, is that it could indeed fuel the populist movements that we've been talking about tonight around the globe. And so that's something to look out for as we move forward. But at the end of the day, America is bigger than one election.
Okay, last evening when we had a seminar class, we talked over the internet phone with my students who are now studying in Indiana and in Wisconsin, red states. His American friends, classmates, all voted for Clinton. They didn't stay at home, but voted for Clinton. Therefore, very shocked and with the result. And I believe that these Japanese students who are now studying in the U.S., as well as those who have been studied in Hawaii or Michigan. I have one of my students who is in this floor today.
Raise your hand. Don't be shy.
Yeah. Have open-minded friends, and which will be the next generation of America. So I think in this circumstance, I noticed that there are not so many Japanese students here. Raise your hand if you're Japanese students. Right? Yeah, there are several, but not so many, right? So I think I really thank Robert to have this session and have me. But I propose that this talk session is very important, but that will be more significant if we have young college students, both American and Japanese, get together and discuss this result and long-run impact on both Japanese and Americans and Asians and global citizens together in this place. I hope that that kind of a talk session, mainly with young students, will be realized here at the Temple University soon. But thank you again for having me, and thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, Miya. And actually, I think it's a very good idea. I'll explain the reason there's so few students. It's very simple. We're in Tokyo. It's a wonderful city. There are lots of things for young people to do. And I'm sorry to say this. I don't want to disparage the students who are here, and I thank them. But some people who have a social life think we're a little too old for them. I'm sorry. I mean, I know, there's no... I'm sorry, if you look at Anne, I mean, if Anne weren't a good friend, she'd be trying to meet Justin Trudeau somewhere in Roppongi. So she's only here because I asked her, but I know, don't worry, Justin stays up late, so we'll take it. So that's, but I think I will take you on this, and I think we'll try to do something maybe during the daytime, before the nightclubs open. Because the thing is, we also have older people, and they have jobs. So we can't have them during the day. So that's why we have these evening things. But we will. I think it's a very good idea, and I really thank you for this. I'd like to thank everybody. First and foremost, I'd like to thank our student organizers and Enrico, who's their leader. So. these events, I mean, I'm kind of a public face. I mean, as I said, I'm the butler of this organization, but there's a lot of work that goes behind it. It's organized by RICO. It's supported and very well handled by student workers. They run the cameras, the sound. They make sure you have air conditioning. They bring in the seats. They think about how to organize the tables. So really, without them and without RICO's leadership, we wouldn't be here. So I'd like really to thank them, and I think we should all do so. And I also would like to thank the student government, who's here from the student government. So Tiago, who's the president. Tiago is a little too young to run for the White House, but he's done a great job. He set up a very interesting and very well organized live event during the election, brought in a lot of media. And last but not least, I'd like to thank our panel. Now, as you know, we're a very poor university because the Ministry of Education in Japan, in Trump-like fashion, doesn't really want foreign universities. So we get very little money. So we can't offer you an honorarium, but we can offer you a calendar by our students. So thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. And our next event is November 15th, right? Turning swords into plowshares on August 1945. So again, I'd like to thank everybody, and please thank our panelists.